The Closing of the American Mind, How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students, by Allan Bloom.
This essay, a meditation on the state of our souls, is written from the perspective of a teacher. Such a perspective, although it has grave limitations and is accompanied by dangerous temptations, is a privileged one. It is neither simply dependent on what students think they want, nor is it imposed on him by the demands of a particular society. The teacher is, willy-nilly, guided by the awareness or the divination that there is a human nature and that assisting its fulfillment is his task. He does not come to this by way of abstractions or complicated reasoning. He sees it in the eyes of his students. Those students are only potential, but potential points beyond itself, and this is the source of the hope, almost always disappointed, but ever renascent, that man is not just a creature of accident, chained to and formed by the particular cave in which he is born. No real teacher can doubt that his task is to assist his pupil to fulfill human nature against all the deforming forces of convention and prejudice. The vision of what that nature is may be clouded. The teacher may be more or less limited, but his activity is solicited by something beyond him that at the same time provides him with a standard for judging his students. Moreover, there is no real teacher who does not in practice believe in the existence of the soul, or in a magic that acts on the soul through speech. Fascination with one's students leads to an awareness of the various kinds of soul and their various needs and capacities. From the teacher's standpoint, thus understood, I have, for more than 30 years, with the most intense interest, watched and listened to students, what they bring to their higher education in passions, curiosities, longings, and especially previous experience has changed, and therewith the task of educating them has changed. In this book, I am attempting to make a contribution to understanding this generation. I am not moralizing. I no more want to be Jeremiah than Pollyanna. More than anything else, this book is to be taken as a report from the front. The reader can judge for himself the gravity of our situation. Every age has its problems, and I do not claim that things were wonderful in the past. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. These are things you don't think about. The students' backgrounds are as various as America can provide. Some are religious, some atheists, some are to the left, some to the right. Some intend to be scientists, some humanists, or professionals or businessmen. Some are poor, some rich. They are unified only in their relativism and in their allegiance to equality. And the two are related in a moral intention. The relativity of truth is not a theoretical insight, but a moral postulate, the condition of a free society, or so they see it. This framework is the modern replacement for the inalienable natural rights that were the traditional American grounds for a free society. That it is a moral issue for students is revealed by the character of their response when challenged, a combination of disbelief and anger. Are you an absolutist? The only alternative they know, uttered in the same tone as, are you a monarchist? Or do you really believe in witches? This disbelief leads into the indignation. For someone who believes in witches might well be a witch hunter or a Salem judge. The danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance. Relativism is necessary to openness, and this is the virtue, the only virtue, which all primary education for more than 50 years has dedicated itself to inculcating. Openness, and the relativism that makes it the only plausible stance in the face of various claims to truth and various ways of life, is the great insight of our times. The true believer is the real danger. The study of history and of culture teaches that all the world was mad in the past. Men always thought that they were right, and that led to wars, persecutions, slavery, xenophobia, racism, and chauvinism. The point is not to correct the mistakes and really be right. Rather, it is not to think you are right at all. The students, of course, cannot defend their opinion. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. The best they can do is point out all the opinions and cultures there are now and have been in the past. By what right, they ask, do I or anyone else say that one is better than the others? If I pose the routine questions designed to confute them and to make them think, such as, if you had been a British administrator in India, would you have let the natives under your governance burn the widow at the funeral of a man who had died? They either remain silent or reply that the British should never have been there in the first place. It is not that they know very much about other nations or about their own. The purpose of their education was not to make them scholars, but to provide them with a moral virtue, openness. Actually, our openness results in conformism and in ignorance of other times and places. In the rest of the world, there is a drab diversity that teaches only that values are relative, whereas here we can create whatever fresh and colorful lifestyles we want. Our openness means that we do not need others. Thus, what is advertised as a great opening is a great closing. It is the rarest of occurrences to find a youngster who has been infused by this education with a longing to know all about China, or the Romans, or the Jews. All to the contrary. There is an indifference to such things, for relativism has extinguished the real motive of education, the search for the good life. As a result, young Americans have less and less knowledge of or interest in foreign places. In the past, there were many students who actually knew something about and loved England, France, Germany, or Italy. They dreamed of living there, or thought that their lives would be made more interesting by assimilating their languages and literatures. Such students have almost disappeared, and young Americans are similarly indifferent to the past. No longer is there a hope that there are great wise men in other places and times who can reveal the truth about life. Gone is the real historical sense of a Machiavelli, who rested a few hours from each busy day in which to don regal and courtly garments, enter the courts of the ancients, and speak with them. Practically all that young Americans have today is an insubstantial awareness that there are many cultures accompanied by a saccharine moral drawn from that awareness. We should all get along. Yet the fact that there have been different opinions about good and bad in different times and places in no way proves that none is true or superior to others. To say that it does so prove is as absurd as to say that the diversity of points of view expressed in a college bull session proves that there is no truth. But the difference of opinion would seem to raise the question as to which is true or right, rather than to banish it. The natural reaction is to try to resolve the difference, to examine the claims and reasons for each opinion. Modern relativists take that same observation as proof that such investigation is impossible. Thus, students and the rest of us are deprived of the primary excitement derived from the discovery of diversity, the impulse of Odysseus, who, according to Dante, traveled the world to see the virtues and vices of men. I know that men are likely to bring what are only their prejudices to the judgment of alien peoples. Avoiding that is one of the main purposes of education. But trying to prevent it by removing the authority of man's reason is to render ineffective the instrument that can correct their prejudices. True openness is the accompaniment of the desire to know, hence of the awareness of ignorance. To deny the possibility of knowing good and bad is to suppress true openness. Historicism and cultural relativism actually are a means to avoid testing our own prejudices. There are thus two kinds of openness: the openness of indifference, promoted with the twin purposes of humbling our intellectual pride and letting us be whatever we want to be, and the openness that invites us to the quest for knowledge and certitude, for which history and the various cultures provide a brilliant array of examples for examination. This second kind of openness encourages the desire that animates and makes interesting every serious student. I want to know what is good for me, what will make me happy. But the openness of indifference stunts that desire. If openness means to go with the flow, it is necessarily an accommodation to the present. That present is so closed to doubt about so many things impeding the progress of its principles that unqualified openness to it would mean forgetting the despised alternatives to it, knowledge of which makes us aware of what is doubtful in it. True openness means closeness to all the charms that make us comfortable with the present. I used to think that young Americans began whatever education they were to get at the age of 18, that they arrived at the university clean slates, unaware of their deeper selves and the world beyond their superficial experience. Young Americans seemed to be natural savages when they came to the university. They had hardly heard the names of the writers who were the daily fare of their counterparts across the Atlantic, let alone took it into their heads that they could have a relationship to them. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba? This American intellectual obtuseness could seem horrifying and barbarous, a stunting of full humanity, an incapacity to experience the beautiful, an utter lack of engagement in the civilization's ongoing discourse. But for me, and for many better observers, this constituted a large part of the charm of American students. Very often, natural curiosity and the love of knowing appeared to come into their own in the first flush of maturity, without traditional constraint or encouragements, without society's rewards and punishments, Without snobism or exclusivity, some Americans discovered that they had a boundless thirst for significant awareness, that their souls had spaces of which they were unaware and which cried out for furnishing. For Americans, the works of the great writers could be the bright, sunlit uplands where they could find the outside, the authentic liberation for which this essay is a plea. Young Americans, that is, some young Americans, gave promise of a continuing vitality for the tradition because they did not take it to be a tradition. But it may very well be that I was wrong. I have come to wonder whether my conviction, the old great book's conviction, was correct. That conviction was that nature is the only thing that counts in education, that the human desire to know is permanent, that all it really needs is the proper nourishment, and that education is merely putting the feast on the table. At the very best, it is clear to me now that nature needs the cooperation of convention. At worst, I fear that spiritual entropy, or an evaporation of the soul's boiling blood, is taking place, a fear that Nietzsche thought justified and made the center of all his thought. He may not have been right, but his case looks stronger all the time. The students are not at fault, but today they know so much less, are so much more cut off from the tradition, are so much intellectually slacker, that they make their predecessors look like prodigies of culture. The soil is ever thinner, and I doubt whether it can now sustain the taller growths. My early experience of American simplicity had persuaded me that we could begin with nothing, that uncultivated nature sufficed. I had not, however, paid sufficient attention to what students actually used to bring with them, the education that was once in the air that helped launch them. Most students could be counted on to know the Bible, that ubiquitous source of the older traditions, Moses and the tables of the law, Jesus and his preaching of brotherly love, had an imaginative existence. Passages from the Psalms and the Gospels echoed in children's heads. But as the respect for the sacred, the latest fad, has soared, real religion and knowledge of the Bible have diminished to the vanishing point. Most students also participated in a remarkably unified and explicit political tradition that possesses one writing known to everyone and probably believed by most, the Declaration of Independence. But the unity, grandeur, and attendant folklore of the founding heritage was attacked from so many directions in the last half-century that it gradually disappeared from daily life and from textbooks. It all began to seem like Washington and a cherry tree, not the sort of thing to teach children seriously. The leading ideas of the Declaration began to be understood as 18th century myths or ideologies. Thus, openness has driven out the local deities. There is no immediate experience of the nation's meaning or its project, which would provide the basis for adult reflection on regimes and statesmanship. Students now arrive at the university ignorant and cynical about our political heritage, lacking the wherewithal to be either inspired by it or seriously critical of it. This gradual stilling of the old political and religious echoes in the souls of the young accounts for the difference between the students I knew at the beginning of my teaching career and those I face now. The loss of the books has made them narrower and flatter. narrower because they lack what is most necessary, a real basis for discontent with the present and awareness that there are alternatives to it. Flatter because without interpretations of things, without the poetry or the imagination's activity, their souls are like mirrors, not of nature, but of what is around. The refinement of the mind's eye that permits it to see the delicate distinctions among men, among their deeds and their motives, and constitutes real taste, is impossible without the assistance of literature in the grand style. At all events, whatever the cause, our students have lost the practice of and taste for reading. They have not learned how to read, nor do they have the expectation of delight or improvement from reading. When I first noticed the decline in reading during the late 60s, I began asking my large introductory classes, and any other group of younger students to which I spoke, what books really count for them. Most are silent, puzzled by the question. The notion of books as companions is foreign to them. Justice Black, with his tattered copy of the Constitution in his pocket at all times, is not an example that would mean much to them. There is no printed word to which they look for counsel, inspiration, or joy. Imagine such a young person walking through the Louvre or the Uffizi, and you can immediately grasp the condition of his soul. In his innocence of the stories of biblical and Greek or Roman antiquity, Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, and all the others can say nothing to him. All he sees are colors and forms. Modern art. These artists counted on immediate recognition of their subjects, and what is more, on their having a powerful meaning for their viewers. The works were the fulfillment of those meanings, giving them a sensuous reality, and hence completing them. Without those meanings, and without there being something essential to the viewer as a moral, political, and religious being, the works lose their essence. One of the most flattering things that ever happened to me as a teacher occurred when I received a postcard from a very good student on his first visit to Italy. He wrote, "You are not a professor of political philosophy, but a travel agent." Nothing could have better expressed my intention as an educator. He thought I had prepared him to see. Then he could begin thinking for himself, with something to think about. The real sensation of the Florence in which Machiavelli is believable is worth all the formulas of metaphysics 10 times over. Education, in our times, must try to find whatever there is in students that might yearn for completion, and to reconstruct the learning that would enable them autonomously to seek that completion. In a less grandiose vein, students today have nothing like the Dickens who gave so many of us the unforgettable Pecksniffs, Micawbers, Pips, with which we sharpened our vision, allowing us some subtlety in our distinction of human types. It is a complex set of experiences that enables one to say so simply, he is a Scrooge. Without literature, no such observations are possible, and the fine art of comparison is lost. The psychological obtuseness of our students is appalling, because they have only pop psychology to tell them what people are like and the range of their motives. As the awareness that we owed almost exclusively to literary genius falters, people become more alike, for want of knowing they can be otherwise. Again, this is not the fault of the students. Lack of education simply results in students seeking for enlightenment wherever it is readily available, without being able to distinguish between the sublime and trash, insight and propaganda. Thus, the failure to read good books both enfeebles the vision and strengthens our most fatal tendency, the belief that the here and now is all there is. What poor substitutes for real diversity are the wild rainbows of dyed hair and other external differences that tell the observer nothing about what is inside.
Rock music. Professor Bloom is a critic of rock music, but he is an unusual critic. He is not primarily concerned with the moral effects of this music. Rather, he argues that rock music has had a devastating effect on education, because it ruins the imagination of young people and deprives them of the tastes and sentiments that can find expression in a liberal education. Professor Bloom argues that the inner life of today's young people is connected with their music, but this music appeals primarily to untutored sexual desire. The untutored pleasures induced by rock music make it very difficult for young people to have a passionate interest in older art and thought. The goal of liberal education is a harmony of the passions and reason, of human pleasures and human duties. But rock music destroys the possibility of this harmony, according to Professor Bloom, because it appeals to childish passions without educating them, and permanently turns the sentiments away from the kinds of pleasure and admiration encouraged by liberal studies.
Though students do not have books, they most emphatically do have music. Nothing is more singular about this generation than its addiction to music. This is the age of music and the states of soul that accompany it. Today, a very large proportion of young people between the ages of 10 and 20 live for music. It is their passion. Nothing else excites them as it does. They cannot take seriously anything alien to music. When they are in school and with their families, they are longing to plug themselves back into their music. Nothing surrounding them, school, family, church, has anything to do with their musical world. At best, that ordinary life is neutral, but mostly it is an impediment, drained of vital content, even a thing to be rebelled against. This music is available 24 hours a day, everywhere. There is the stereo in the home, in the car. There are concerts, there are music videos, with special channels exclusively devoted to them. There are the Walkmans, so that no place, not public transportation, not the library, prevents students from communing with the muse, even while studying. The power of music in the soul, described to Jessica marvelously by Lorenzo in The Merchant of Venice, has been recovered after a long period of desuetude. And it is rock music alone that has effected this restoration. Classical music is dead among the young. This assertion will, I know, be hotly disputed by many who, unwilling to admit tidal changes, can point to the proliferation on campuses of classes in classical music appreciation and practice, as well as performance groups of all kinds. Their presence is undeniable, but classical music is now a special taste, like Greek language or pre-Columbian archaeology, not a common culture of reciprocal communication and psychological shorthand. 30 years ago, most middle-class families made some of the old European music a part of the home, partly because they liked it, partly because they thought it was good for the kids. University students usually had some early emotive association with Beethoven, Chopin, and Brahms, which was a permanent part of their makeup and to which they were likely to respond throughout their lives. But all that has changed. Rock music is as unquestioned and unproblematic as the air the students breathe, and very few have any acquaintance at all with classical music. This is a constant surprise to me, and one of the strange aspects of my relations with good students is that I frequently introduce them to Mozart. This is a pleasure for me, inasmuch as it is always pleasant to give people gifts that please them. It is interesting to see in what ways their studies are complemented by such music. But this is something utterly new to me as a teacher. Symptomatic of this change is how seriously students now take the famous passages on musical education in Plato's Republic. In the past, students, good liberals that they always are, were indignant at the censorship of poetry as a threat to free inquiry. But they were really thinking of science and politics. They hardly paid attention to the discussion of music itself, and to the extent that they even thought about it, were really puzzled by Plato's devoting time to rhythm and melody in a serious treatise on political philosophy. Their experience of music was as an entertainment, a matter of indifference to political and moral life. Students today, on the contrary, know exactly why Plato takes music so seriously. They know it affects life very profoundly, and are indignant because Plato seems to want to rob them of their most intimate pleasure. They are drawn into argument with Plato about the experience of music, and the dispute centers on how to evaluate it and deal with it. This encounter not only helps to illuminate the phenomenon of contemporary music, but also provides a model of how contemporary students can profitably engage with a classic text. The very fact of their fury shows how much Plato threatens what is dear and intimate to them. They are little able to defend their experience, which had seemed unquestionable until questioned. Yet, if a student can, and this is most difficult and unusual, draw back, get a critical distance on what he clings to, come to doubt the ultimate value of what he loves, he has taken the first and most difficult step toward the philosophical conversion. Indignation is the soul's defense against the wound of doubt about its own. It reorders the cosmos to support the justice of its cause. Recognizing indignation for what it is constitutes knowledge of the soul, and is thus an experience more philosophic than the study of mathematics. It is Plato's teaching that music, by its nature, encompasses all that is today most resistant to philosophy. So it may well be that through the thicket of our greatest corruption runs the path to awareness of the oldest truths. Plato's teaching about music is, put simply, that rhythm and melody, accompanied by dance, are the barbarous expression of the soul. Barbarous, not animal. Music is the medium of the human soul in its most ecstatic condition of wonder and terror. Music is the soul's primitive and primary speech, and it is allogon, without articulate speech or reason. It is not only not reasonable, it is hostile to reason. Even when articulate speech is added, it is utterly subordinate to and determined by the music and the passions it expresses. Civilization, or to say the same thing, education, is the taming or domestication of the soul's raw passions, not suppressing or excising them, which would deprive the soul of its energy, but forming and informing them. The goal of harmonizing the enthusiastic part of the soul with what develops later, the rational part, is perhaps impossible to attain, but without it, man can never be whole. Music or poetry, which is what music becomes as reason emerges, always involves a delicate balance between passion and reason. Even in its highest and most developed forms, religious, warlike, and erotic, that balance is always tipped, if ever so slightly, toward the passionate. Music, as everyone experiences, provides an unquestionable justification and a fulfilling pleasure for the activities it accompanies. The soldier who hears the marching band is enthralled and reassured. The religious man is exalted in his prayer by the sound of the organ in the church, and the lover is carried away and his conscience stilled by the romantic guitar. Armed with music, men can damn rational doubt. Out of the music emerge the gods that suit it, and they educate men by their example and their commandments. Plato's Socrates disciplines the ecstasies and thereby provides little consolation or hope to men. According to the Socratic formula, the lyrics, speech, and hence reason, must determine the music, the harmony, and the rhythm. Pure music can never endure this constraint. Students are not in a position to know the pleasures of reason. They can only see it as a disciplinary and repressive parent. But they do see, in the case of Plato, that the parent has figured out what they are up to. Plato teaches that in order to take the spiritual temperature of an individual or a society, one must mark the music. To Plato and Nietzsche, the history of music is a series of attempts to give form and beauty to the dark, chaotic, premonitory forces in the soul, to make them serve a higher purpose, an ideal, to give man's duties a fullness. Bach's religious intentions, or Beethoven's revolutionary and humane ones, are clear examples. Such cultivation of the soul uses the passions and satisfies them while sublimating them and giving them an artistic unity. A man whose noblest activities are accompanied by a music that expresses them while providing pleasure is whole, and there is no tension in him between the pleasant and the good. By contrast, a man whose business life is prosaic and unmusical, and whose leisure is made up of coarse, intense entertainments, is divided, and each side of his existence is undermined by the other. This is the significance of rock music. I do not suggest that it has any high intellectual sources, but it has risen to its current heights in the education of the young on the ashes of classical music, and in an atmosphere in which there is no intellectual resistance to attempts to tap the rawest passions. Modern-day rationalists, such as economists, are indifferent to it and what it represents. The irrationalists are all for it. There is no need to fear that the blonde beasts are going to come forth from the bland souls of our adolescents. But rock music has one appeal only, a barbaric appeal to sexual desire. Not love, not eros, but sexual desire undeveloped and untutored. It acknowledges the first emanations of children's emerging sensuality and addresses them seriously, eliciting them and legitimating them, not as little sprouts that must be carefully tended in order to grow into gorgeous flowers, but as the real thing. Never was there an art form directed so exclusively to children. Ministering to, and according with the arousing and cathartic music, the lyrics celebrate puppy love, as well as polymorphous attractions, and fortify them against traditional ridicule and shame. The words implicitly and explicitly describe bodily acts that satisfy sexual desire and treat them as its only natural and routine culmination for children who do not yet have the slightest imagination of love, marriage, or family. Such polluted sources issue in a muddy stream where only monsters can swim. A glance at the videos that project images on the wall of Plato's cave, since MTV took it over, suffices to prove this. Hitler's image recurs frequently enough in exciting contexts to give one pause. Nothing noble, sublime, profound, delicate, tasteful, or even decent can find a place in such tableau. There is room only for the intense, changing, crude, and immediate. Tocqueville warned in Democracy in America that this would be the character of democratic art, but it is combined with a pervasiveness, importance, and content beyond Tocqueville's wildest imagination. This strong stimulant was for a very long time, almost 15 years, epitomized in a single figure, Mick Jagger. A shrewd, middle-class boy, he played the possessed lower-class demon and teenage satyr up until he was 40, with one eye on the mobs of children of both sexes whom he stimulated to a sensual frenzy, and the other eye winking at the unerotic, commercially motivated adults who handle the money. In his act, he was male and female, heterosexual and homosexual, unencumbered by modesty. He could enter everyone's dreams, promising to do everything with everyone, and above all, he legitimated drugs, which were the real thrill that parents and policemen conspired to deny his youthful audience. He was beyond the law, moral and political, and thumbed his nose at it. Along with all this, there were nasty little appeals to the suppressed inclinations towards sexism, racism, and violence, indulgence in which is not now publicly respectable. He was the hero and the model for countless young persons in universities as well as elsewhere. Mick Jagger played the role in their lives that Napoleon played in the lives of ordinary young Frenchmen throughout the 19th century. In the last couple of years, Jagger has begun to fade. Whether Michael Jackson, Prince, or Boy George can take his place is uncertain. They are even weirder than he is, and one wonders what new strata of taste they have discovered. Although each differs from the others, the essential character of musical entertainment is not changing. There is only a constant search for variations on the theme. This description may seem exaggerated, but only because some would prefer to regard it as such. The continuing exposure to rock music is a reality, not one confined to a particular class or kind of child. It is the youth culture, and there is now no countervailing nourishment for the spirit. My concern here is not with the moral effects of this music, whether it leads to sex, violence, or drugs. The issue here is its effect on education, and I believe it ruins the imagination of young people and makes it very difficult for them to have a passionate relationship to the art and thought that are the substance of liberal education. The first sensuous experiences are decisive in determining the taste for the whole of life, and they are the link between the animal and spiritual in us. The period of nascent sensuality has always been used for sublimation, in the sense of making sublime. Education should attach youthful inclinations and longings to music, pictures, and stories that provide the transition to the fulfillment of the human duties and the enjoyment of the human pleasures. Lessing, speaking of Greek sculpture, said, "Beautiful men made beautiful statues, and the city had beautiful statues in part to thank for beautiful citizens." This formula encapsulates the fundamental principle of the aesthetic education of man. Young men and women were attracted by the beauty of heroes whose very bodies expressed their nobility. The deeper understanding of the meaning of nobility comes later, but is prepared by the sensuous experience and is actually contained in it. What the senses long for, and what reason later sees as good, are thereby not at tension with one another. Education is not sermonizing to children against their instincts and pleasures, but providing a natural continuity between what they feel and what they can and should be. But this is a lost art. Now we have come to exactly the opposite point. Rock music encourages passions and provides models that have no relation to any life the young people who go to universities can possibly lead, or to the kinds of admiration encouraged by liberal studies. Without the cooperation of the sentiments, anything other than technical education is a dead letter. The students will get over this music, or at least the exclusive passion for it. But they will do so in the same way Freud says that men accept the reality principle, as something harsh, grim, and essentially unattractive, a mere necessity. Their energy has been sapped, and they do not expect their life's activity to produce anything but a living. But liberal education encourages the belief that the good life is the pleasant life, and that the best life is the most pleasant life. These students will assiduously study economics or the professions, and the Michael Jackson costume will slip off to reveal a Brooks Brothers suit beneath. They will want to get ahead and live comfortably, but this life is as empty and false as the one they left behind. The choice is not between quick fixes and dull calculation. This is what liberal education is meant to show them. But as long as they have the Walkman on, they cannot hear what the great tradition has to say. And after its prolonged use, when they take it off, they find they are deaf. Students these days are, in general, nice. I choose the word carefully. They are not particularly moral or noble. Such niceness is a facet of democratic character when times are good. Neither war, nor tyranny, nor want has hardened them or made demands on them. The wounds and rivalries caused by class distinction have disappeared. Students are free of most constraints, and their families make sacrifices for them without asking for much in the way of obedience or respect. Religion and national origin have almost no noticeable effect on their social life or their career prospects. Although few really believe in the system, they do not have any burning sentiment that injustice is being done to them. The drugs and the sex, once thought to be forbidden, are available in the quantities required for sensible use. A few radical feminists still feel the old-time religion, but most of the women are comfortably assured that not much stands in the way of their careers. Above all, there are none of the longings, romantic or otherwise, that used to make bourgeois society, or society in general, repugnant to the young. Students these days are pleasant, friendly, and if not great-souled, at least not particularly mean-spirited. Their primary preoccupation is themselves, understood in the narrowest sense. Country, religion, family, ideas of civilization, all the sentimental and historical forces that stood between cosmic infinity and the individual, providing some notion of a place within the whole, have been rationalized and have lost their compelling force. America is experienced not as a common project, but as a framework within which people are only individuals, where they are left alone. The advanced left talks about self-fulfillment. The right, in its most popular form, is libertarian, i.e., the right-wing form of the left, in favor of everybody's living as he pleases. The only forms of intrusion on the private life characteristic of liberal democracies, taxes and military service, are not now present in student life. If there is an inherent political impulse in man, it is certainly being frustrated. But it has already been so attenuated by modernity that it is hardly experienced. Students may indeed feel a sense of impotence, a sense that they have little or no influence over the collective life, but essentially they live comfortably within the administrative state that has replaced politics. Very few of them are destined for political life. Neither duty nor pleasure involve students with the political, and our lives exhibit in the extreme what Burke and Tocqueville said about the disappearance of citizens and statesmen. The honesty of this generation of students causes them to laugh when asked to act as though they were powerful agents in world history. They know the truth of Tocqueville's dictum that, in democratic societies, each citizen is habitually busy with the contemplation of a very petty object, which is himself. The resulting inevitable individualism, endemic to our regime, has been reinforced by another unintended and unexpected development, the decline of the family. The family is the intermediary between individual and society, providing quasi-natural attachments beyond the individual. It once gave men and women unqualified concern for at least some others, and created an entirely different relation to society from that which the isolated individual has. Parents, husbands, wives, and children are hostages to the community. They provide a material stake in its future. This is not quite instinctive love of country, but it is love of country for love of one's own. It is the gentle form of patriotism, one that flows most easily out of self-interest without the demand for much self-denial. The decay of the family means that devotion to the community would require extreme self-abnegation in an era when there is no good reason for anything but self-indulgence. Thus, the souls of young people are in a condition like that of the first men in the state of nature, spiritually unclad, unconnected, isolated, with no inherited or unconditional connection with anything or anyone. They can be anything they want to be, but they have no particular reason to want to be anything in particular. They are free to decide whether they will believe in God or be atheists, or leave their options open by being agnostic, whether they will be straight or gay, or again keep their options open, whether they will marry and whether they will stay married, whether they will have children, and so on endlessly. The young are exaggerated versions of Plato's description of the young in democracies. Quote, "The democratic youth lives along day by day, gratifying the desire that occurs to him, at one time drinking and listening to the flute, at another downing water and reducing, now practicing gymnastic, and again idling and neglecting everything, and sometimes spending his time as though he were occupied with philosophy. Often he engages in politics, and jumping up says and does whatever chances to come to him. And if he admires any soldiers, he turns in that direction, and if it's money-makers, in that one. And there is neither order nor necessity in his life, but calling it sweet, free, and blessed, he follows it throughout." End of quote. Why are we surprised that such unfurnished persons should be preoccupied principally with themselves and with finding means to avoid permanent free fall? The most visible sign of our increasing separateness, and in its turn, the cause of ever greater separateness, is divorce. It has a deep influence on our universities because more and more of the students are products of it. And they not only have problems themselves, but also affect other students and the general atmosphere. Divorce in America is the most palpable indication that people are not made to live together. There is a quest, but ever more hopeless, for arrangements and ways of putting the broken pieces back together. The task is equivalent to squaring the circle, because everyone loves himself most, but wants others to love him more than they love themselves. Such is particularly the demand of children, against which parents are now rebelling. A young person's qualified or conditional attachment to divorced parents merely reciprocates what he necessarily sees as their conditional attachment to him. This is entirely different from the classic problem of loyalty to families or other institutions, which were clearly dedicated to their members. In the past, such breaking away was sometimes necessary, but always morally problematic. Today, it is normal, and this is another reason why the classic literature is alien to so many of our young, for it is largely concerned with liberation from real claims like family, faith, or country, whereas now the movement is in the opposite direction, a search for claims on oneself that have some validity. Of course, many families were always unhappy, but that is irrelevant. The important lesson that the family taught was the existence of an unbreakable bond, for better or for worse, between human beings. The decomposition of this bond is surely America's most urgent social problem, but nobody even tries to do anything about it. The tide seems to be irresistible. Among the many items on the agenda of those promoting America's moral regeneration, I never find marriage and divorce. A university teacher of liberal arts cannot help confronting special handicaps, a slight deformity of the spirit in the students, ever more numerous, whose parents are divorced. I do not have the slightest doubt that they do as well as others in all kinds of specialized subjects, but I find that they are not as open to the serious study of philosophy and literature as some other students are. I would guess this is because they are less eager to look into the meaning of their lives, or to risk shaking their received opinions. In order to live with the chaos of their experience, they tend to have rigid frameworks about what is right and wrong and how they ought to live. They are full of desperate platitudes about self-determination, respect for other people's rights and decisions, the need to work out one's individual values and commitments, and so on. All this is a thin veneer over boundless seas of rage, doubt, and fear. Young people are habitually able to jettison their habits of belief for an exciting idea. They have little to lose. Although this is not really philosophy, because they're not aware of how high the stakes are, in this period of their lives they can experiment with the unconventional and acquire deeper habits of belief and some learning to go along with them. But children of divorced parents often lack this intellectual daring because they lack the natural, youthful confidence in the future. Fear of both isolation and attachment clouds their prospects. A large measure of their enthusiasm has been extinguished and replaced by self-protectiveness. Similarly, their open confidence in friendship as part of the newly discovered search for the good is somewhat stunted. The Glauconian eros for the discovery of nature has suffered more damage in them than in most. Such students can make their disarray in the cosmos the theme of their reflection and study, but it is a grim and dangerous business, and more than any students I have known, they evoke pity. They are indeed victims. Now we have arrived at one of the ultimate acts in our drama, the informing and reforming of our most intimate private lives by our principles. Sex and its consequences, love, marriage, and family, have finally become the theme of the national project. And here the problem of nature, always present, but always repressed in the reconstruction of man demanded by freedom and equality, becomes insistent. In order to intuit the meaning of equality, we have no need for the wild imaginative genius of Aristophanes, who, in his Assembly of Women, contrives the old hags entitled by law to sexual satisfaction from handsome young males, or of Plato, who in his Republic prescribed naked exercises for men and women together. We only have to look around us if we have eyes to see. The change in sexual relations, which now provide an unending challenge to human ingenuity, came over us in two successive waves in the last 2 decades. The first was the sexual revolution, the second, feminism. The sexual revolution marched under the banner of freedom, feminism under that of equality. Although they went arm in arm for a while, Their differences eventually put them at odds with each other. As Tocqueville said, freedom and equality would always be. This is manifest in the squabble over pornography, which pits liberated sexual desire against feminist resentment about stereotyping. We are presented with the amusing spectacle of pornography, clad in armor borrowed from the heroic struggles for freedom of speech, doing battle with feminism, newly draped in the robes of community morality, using arguments associated with conservatives who defend traditional sex roles. In the background stand the liberals, wringing their hands in confusion because they wish to favor both sides and cannot. Sexual liberation presented itself as a bold affirmation of the senses and of undeniable natural impulse against our puritanical heritage, society's conventions and repressions, bolstered by biblical myths about original sin. Beginning in the early 60s, there was a gradual testing of the limits on sexual expression. The disapproval of parents and teachers of youngsters sleeping or living together was easily overcome. The moral inhibitions, the fear of disease, the risk of pregnancy, the family and social consequences of premarital intercourse, everything that stood in its way suddenly was no longer there. Students were no longer ashamed to give public evidence of sexual attraction or of its fulfillment. This emancipation had in its intention and its effect the accentuation of the difference between the sexes. Making love was to be the primary activity, so men and women were to be more emphatically male and female. The immediate promise of sexual liberation was, simply, happiness, understood as the release of energies that had been stored up over millennia during the dark night of repression. However, the lion roaring behind the door of the closet turned out, when that door was opened, to be a little domesticated cat. In fact, seen from a long historical perspective, sexual liberation might be interpreted as the recognition that sexual passion is no longer dangerous in us, and that it is safer to give it free course than to risk rebellion by restraining it. I once asked the class how it could be that not too long ago parents would have said, "Never darken our door again," to wayward daughters, whereas now they rarely protest when boyfriends sleep over in their homes. A very nice, very normal young woman responded, "Because it's no big deal." That says it all. This passionlessness is the most striking effect or revelation of the sexual revolution, and it makes the younger generation more or less incomprehensible to older folks. In all this, the sexual revolution was precisely what it said it was, a liberation from conventional restraints. Some of the harshness of nature even asserted itself beneath the shattered conventions. The young were more apt to profit from the revolution than the old, the beautiful more than the ugly. Feminism, on the other hand, was, to the extent it presented itself as liberation, much more a liberation from nature than from convention or society. Therefore, it was grimmer, unerotic, more of an abstract project. It required not so much the abolition of law, but the institution of law and political activism. Instinct did not suffice. The programmatic language shifted from living naturally to vaguer terms such as self-definition, self-fulfillment, fashioning a lifestyle. The women's movement is not founded on nature. Although feminism sees the position of women as a result of nurture and not nature, its crucial contention is that biology should not be destiny, and biology is surely natural. Moreover, it is very often asserted that science's conquest of nature, in the form of the pill and labor-saving devices, has made woman's emancipation from the home possible. Feminism is in accord with and encourages many elements of the sexual revolution, but it uses them to different ends. In making sex easy, liberation can trivialize, de-eroticize, and demystify sexual relations. Feminism acted as a depressant on the bacchanalian mood of the sexual revolution, as nakedness in Plato's Republic led not to great indulgences, but to an unromantic regulation and manipulation of sexual desire for public purposes. Sex had a short day in the sun before it had to be reined in to accommodate the feminist sensibility. Male sexual passion has become sinful again because it culminates in sexism. Women are made into objects. They are raped by their husbands as well as by strangers. They are sexually harassed by professors and employers at school and at work, and their children, whom they leave in daycare centers in order to pursue their careers, are sexually abused by teachers. All these crimes must be legislated against and punished. What sensitive male can avoid realizing how dangerous his sexual passion is? Men had failed to read the fine print in the Emancipation Proclamation. The new interference with sexual desire is more comprehensive, more intense, more difficult to escape than the older conventions, the grip of which was so recently relaxed. Central to the feminist project is the suppression of modesty, in which the sexual revolution played a critical preparatory role. The sexual revolution, however, wanted men and women to get together, bodily, while feminism wanted them to be able easily to get along separately. Modesty in the old dispensation was the female virtue because it governed the powerful desire that related men to women, providing a gratification in harmony with the procreation and rearing of children, the risk and responsibility of which fell naturally, that is, biologically, on women. Although modesty impeded sexual intercourse, its result was to make such gratification central to a serious life and to enhance the delicate interplay between the sexes, which makes acquiescence of the will as important as possession of the body. Diminution or suppression of modesty certainly makes attaining the end of desire easier, which was the intention of the sexual revolution, but it also dismantles the structure of involvement and attachment, reducing sex to the thing in itself. Female modesty extends sexual differentiation from the sexual act to the whole of life. It makes men and women always men and women. The consciousness of directedness toward one another informs every common deed. As long as modesty operates, men and women together are never just lawyers or pilots together. They have something else, always potentially very important, in common. As lawyers or pilots, men and women are the same. As lovers or parents, they are very different, but inwardly related by sharing the naturally given end of continuing the species. Modesty is a constant reminder of their peculiar relatedness. It is a voice constantly repeating that a man and a woman have a work to do together that is far different from that found in the marketplace and of a far greater importance. In this light, we can discern the outlines of what has been going on recently among us. Conservatives who have been heartened by the latest developments within the women's movement are mistaken if they think that they and the movement are on common ground. Certainly, both sides are against pornography, but the feminists are against it because it is a reminiscence of the old love relationship, which involved differentiated sexual roles now interpreted as bondage and domination. Pornography demystifies that relationship, leaving the merely sexual component of male-female relationships without their erotic, romantic, moral, and ideal accompaniments. It caters to and encourages the longing men have for women and its unrestrained, if impoverished, satisfaction. This is what feminist anti-pornographers are against. Not the debasement of sentiment or the threat to the family. Their purpose is not to remystify the worn-out systems, but to push on toward the realm of freedom. They are not for a return to the old romances. It is one thing, however, to want to prevent women from being ravished and brutalized because modesty and purity should be respected and their weakness protected by responsible males, and quite another to protect them from male desire altogether so that they can live as they please. Feminism makes use of conservative moralism to further its own ends. The uneasy bedfellowship of the sexual revolution and feminism produced an odd tension in which all the moral restraints governing nature disappeared, but so did nature. The exhilaration of liberation has evaporated, however, for it is unclear what exactly was liberated, or whether new and more onerous responsibilities have not been placed on us. And this is where we return to the students, for whom everything is new. They are not sure what they feel for one another, and are without guidance about what to do with whatever they may feel. The students of whom I am speaking are aware of all the sexual alternatives, and they feel that all sexual acts that do not involve real harm to others are illicit. They have had sex education in school. Of the biological facts, let them decide the values for themselves variety, if not the options and orientations variety. Birth control devices and ready abortion have been available to them since puberty. For the great majority, sexual intercourse was a normal part of their lives prior to college, and there was no fear of social stigma or even much parental opposition. They are not promiscuous or given to orgies or casual sex. In general, they have one connection at a time, but most have had several serially. Many live together, almost always without expectation of marriage. It is just a convenient arrangement. They are not couples in the sense of having simulacra of marriage, or a way of life different from that of other students not presently so attached. They are roommates, which is what they call themselves, with sex and utilities included in the rent. Every single obstacle to sexual relationships between young, unmarried persons has disappeared, and these relationships are routine. To strangers from another planet, what would be the most striking thing is that sexual passion no longer includes the illusion of eternity. Students today understandably believe that they are the beneficiaries of progress. They have a certain benign contempt for their parents, particularly for their poor mothers, who were sexually inexperienced and had no profession to be taken seriously. And students do not expect to learn anything about their situation from old literature, which, from the Garden of Eden on, made coupling a very dark and complicated business. On reflection, today's students wonder what all the fuss was about. Many think their older brothers and sisters discovered sex, as we now know it to be, in the 60s. I was impressed by students who, in a course on Rousseau's Confessions, were astounded to learn that he had lived with a woman out of wedlock in the 18th century. Where could he have gotten the idea? One must begin to wonder whether there is any permanent literature for them, because there do not seem to them to be permanent problems for them. Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary are adulteresses, but the cosmos no longer rebels at their deed. Anna's son today would probably have been awarded to her in the amicable divorce arrangements of the Karenins. All the romantic novels, with their depictions of highly differentiated men and women, their steamy, sublimated sensuality, and their insistence on the sacredness of the marriage bond, just do not speak to any reality that concerns today's young people. Neither do Romeo and Juliet, who must struggle against parental opposition, Othello and his jealousy, or Miranda's carefully guarded innocence. St. Augustine, as a seminarian told me, had sexual hang-ups. And let us not speak of the Bible, every no in which is now a yes. With the possible exception of Oedipus, they are all gone, and they departed in the company of modesty. When young people today have crushing problems in what used to be called sexual relationships, they cannot trace them back to any moral ambiguity in man's sexual nature. That was, of course, what was erroneously done in the past. This ambiguity of man is well illustrated in the sexual passion and the sentiments that accompany it. Sex may be treated as a pleasure, out of which men and women may make what they will, its promptings followed or rejected, its forms matters of taste, its importance or unimportance in life decided freely by individuals. Or sex can be immediately constitutive of a whole law of life, in which love, marriage, and the rearing of infants is the most important business. It cannot be both. The direction in which we have been going is obvious. Now, it is not entirely correct to say that mankind at large is able to treat sex as a matter of free choice, a choice which initially does not obligate us to others. In a world where the natural basis of sexual differentiation has crumbled, this choice is readily available to men, but less so to women. Man in the state of nature, either in the first one or the one we have now, can walk away from a sexual encounter and never give it another thought. But a woman may have a child, and in fact, as becomes ever clearer, may want to have a child. Sex can be an indifferent thing for men, but it really cannot quite be so for women. This is what might be called the female drama. Modernity promised that all human beings would be treated equally. Women took that promise seriously and rebelled against the old order. But as they have succeeded, men have also been liberated from their old constraints. And women, now liberated and with equal careers, nevertheless find that they still desire to have children, but have no basis for claiming that men should share their desire for children or assume a responsibility for them. So, nature weighs more heavily on women. In the old order, they were subordinated and dependent on men. In the new order, they are isolated, needing men but not able to count on them, and hampered in the free development of their individuality. The promise of modernity is not really fulfilled for women. The best point of entry into the very special world inhabited by today's students is the astonishing fact that they usually do not, in what were once called love affairs, say, "I love you," and never, "I'll always love you." One student told me that of course he says, "I love you," to girlfriends when we are breaking up. It is the clean and easy break, no damage, no fault, at which they are adept. This is understood to be morality, respect for other person's freedom. Perhaps young people do not say, "I love you," because they are honest. They do not experience love. Too familiar with sex to confuse it with love, too preoccupied with their own fates to be victimized by love's mad self-forgetting, the last of the genuine fanaticisms. Young people today are afraid of making commitments, and the point is that love is commitment, and much more. Commitment is a word invented in our abstract modernity to signify the absence of any real motives in the soul for moral dedication. Commitment is gratuitous, motiveless, because the real passions are all low and selfish. One may be sexually attracted, but that does not, so people think, provide any sufficient motive for real and lasting concern for an other. Young people, and not only young people, have studied and practiced a crippled arrows that can no longer take wing and does not contain within it the longing for eternity and the divination of one's relatedness to being. Young men and women distrust eroticism too much to think it a sufficient pointer toward a way of life. Part of the inability to make sexual commitments results from an ideology of the feelings. Young people are always telling me such reasonable things about jealousy and possessiveness. Why should a man or a woman be jealous if his or her partner has sexual relations with someone else? A serious person today does not want to force the feelings of others. The same goes for possessiveness. When I hear such things, all so sensible, I feel that I am in the presence of robots. This ideology only works for people who have had no experience of the feelings, have never loved. These prodigies of reason need never fear Othello's fate. Kill for love? What can that mean? It may very well be that their insensitivity is a suppression of feeling, anxiety about getting hurt. But it might also be the real thing. People may have developed a new kind of soul. Their lack of passion, of hope, of despair, of a sense of the twinship of love and death is incomprehensible to me. Relationships, not love affairs, are what they have. Love suggests something wonderful, exciting, positive, and firmly seated in the passions. A relationship is gray, amorphous, suggestive of a project, without a given content, and tentative. You work at a relationship, whereas love takes care of itself. In a relationship, the difficulties come first, and there is a search for common grounds. Love presents illusions of perfection to the imagination, and is forgetful of all the natural fissures in human connection. About relationships, there is ceaseless, anxious talk, the kind one cannot help overhearing in student hangouts or restaurants, frequented by men and women who are involved with one another, the kind of obsessive prattle so marvelously captured in old Nichols and May routines or Woody Allen films. In one Nichols and May bit, a couple who have just slept together for the first time assert with all the emptiness of doubt, "We are going to have a relationship." The problem is that people have no common object, no common good, no natural complementarity. This is the reason that conversation about relationships remains so vacuous and abstract, with its whole content stored in a bottle labeled commitment. It is also why there is so much talk about phenomena like bonding. One need only compare the countless movies and novels about male bonding with Aristotle's discussion of friendship and the ethics to see that friendship, like its related phenomenon, love, is no longer within our ken. There is a passage in Rousseau's Emile, his educational novel, which keeps coming back to me as I look at my students. Quote, "As soon as they envisage from afar their separation, as soon as they foresee the moment which is going to make them strangers to one another, they are already strangers. Each sets up his own little separate system, and both, engrossed by the time they will no longer be together, stay only reluctantly." End of quote. That is it. Everyone has his own little separate system. The aptest description I can find for the state of students' souls is the psychology of separateness. The possibility of separation is already the fact of separation, inasmuch as people today must plan to be whole and self-sufficient and cannot risk interdependence. Death of a parent,
child, husband, wife, or friend is always a possibility and sometimes a fact. But separation is something very different because it is an intentional rebuff to the demand for reciprocity of attachment, which is the heart of these relations. People can continue to live while related to the dead beloved. They cannot continue to be related to a living beloved who no longer loves or wishes to be loved. This continual shifting of the sands in our desert, separation from places, persons, beliefs, produces the psychic state of nature where reserve and timidity are the prevailing dispositions. We are social solitaries. This is the campus sexual scene. Relativism in theory and lack of relatedness in practice make students unable to think about or look into their futures, and they shrivel up within the confines of the present and material I. They are willing to mutter the prescribed catechism, the substitute for thought, which promises them salvation, but there is little faith. As a very intelligent student said to me, we are all obsessively going to the well, but we always come up dry. The eroticism of our students is lame. It is not the divine madness Socrates praised, or the enticing awareness of incompleteness and the quest to overcome it. It is not nature's grace, which permits a partial being to recover his wholeness in the embrace of another, or a temporal being to long for eternity in the perpetuity of his seed. It is not the hope that all men will remember one's deeds, or the contemplation of perfection. This longing for completeness is the longing for education, and the study of it is education. Socrates' knowledge of ignorance is identical with his perfect knowledge of erotics. The longing for his conversations with which he infected his companions, and which was intensified after his death, and has endured throughout the centuries, proved him to have been both the neediest and most grasping of lovers, and the richest and most giving of beloveds. The sex lives of our students and their reflection on them disarm such longing and make it incomprehensible to them. Reductionism has robbed Eros of its divinatory powers. Because they do not trust it, students have no reverence for themselves. There is almost no remaining link visible to them between what they learn in sex education and Plato's Symposium. Yet only from such dangerous heights can our situation be seen in proper perspective. The fact that this perspective is no longer credible is the measure of our crisis. Rousseau, the founder of the most potent of reductionist teachings about Eros, said that the Symposium is always the book of lovers. Are we lovers anymore? This is my way of putting the educational question of our times. In all species other than man, when an animal reaches puberty, it is all that it will ever be. Only in man is puberty just the beginning. The greater and more interesting part of his learning, moral and intellectual, comes afterwards. And in a civilized man, it is incorporated into his erotic desire. His taste, and hence his choices, are determined during this sentimental education. It is as though his learning were for the sake of his sexuality. Reciprocally, much of the energy for that learning obviously comes from his sexuality. Nobody takes human children who have reached puberty to be adults. We properly sense that there is a long road to adulthood, the condition in which they are able to govern themselves and be true mothers and fathers. This road is the serious part of education, where animal sexuality becomes human sexuality, where instinct gives way in man to choice with regard to the true, the good, and the beautiful. Puberty does not provide man, as it does other animals, with all that he needs to leave behind others of his kind. This means that the animal part of his sexuality is intertwined in the most complex way with the higher reaches of his soul, which must inform the desires with its insight. The most delicate part of education is to keep the two in harmony. I cannot pretend that I understand very much of this mystery, but knowing that I do not know keeps me attentive to, and far from the current simplifications of, the phenomena of this aspect of our nature that links the highest and the lowest in us. I believe that the most interesting students are those who have not settled the sexual problem, who are still young, and even look young for their age, who think there is much to look forward to, and much they must yet grow up to, who are fresh and naive, excited by the mysteries to which they have not yet been fully initiated. There are some who are men and women at the age of 16 who have nothing more to learn about the erotic. They are adult, in the sense that they will no longer change very much. They may become competent specialists, but they are flat-souled. The world is for them what it presents itself to the senses to be. It is unadorned by imagination and devoid of ideals. This flat soul is what the sexual wisdom of our time conspires to make universal. The easy sex of teenagers snips the golden thread linking eros to education. A youngster whose sexual longings, consciously or unconsciously, inform his studies has a very different set of experiences from one in whom such motives are not active. A trip to Florence or to Athens is one thing for a young man who hopes to meet his Beatrice on the Ponte Santa Trinita, or his Socrates in the Agora, and quite another for one who goes without such aching need. The latter is only a tourist. The former is looking for completion. A significant number of students used to arrive at the university physically and spiritually virginal, expecting to lose their innocence there. Their lust was mixed into everything they thought and did. They were painfully aware that they wanted something, but were not quite sure exactly what it was, what form it would take, and what it all meant. The range of satisfactions intimated by their desire moved from prostitutes to Plato and back, from the criminal to the sublime. Above all, they looked for instruction. Practically everything they read in the humanities and social sciences might be a source of learning about their pain and a path to its healing. The itch for what appeared to be only sexual intercourse was the material manifestation of the Delphic oracle's command, which is but a reminder of the most fundamental human desire, to know thyself. Sated with easy, clinical, and sterile satisfactions of body and soul, the students arriving at the university today hardly walk on the enchanted ground they once did.
When President Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, right-thinking persons joined in an angry chorus of protest against such provocative rhetoric. At other times, Mr. Reagan has said that the United States and the Soviet Union have different values, an assertion that those same persons greet with silence or approval. I believe he thought he was saying the same thing in both instances, The different reaction to his different words introduces us to the most important and most astonishing phenomenon of our time, all the more astonishing in being almost unnoticed. There is now an entirely new language of good and evil, originating in an attempt to get beyond good and evil. This new language is that of value relativism, and it prevents us from talking with any conviction about good and evil anymore. Even those who deplore our current moral condition do so in the very language that exemplifies that condition. What was offensive to contemporary ears in President Reagan's use of the word evil was its cultural arrogance, its presumption that he and America know what is good, and its closedness to the dignity of other ways of life. The political corollary is that he is not open to negotiation. The opposition between good and evil is not negotiable and is a cause of war. Those who are interested in conflict resolution find it much easier to reduce the tension between values than the tension between good and evil. Values are insubstantial stuff, existing primarily in the imagination, while death is real. The term value, meaning the radical subjectivity of all beliefs about good and evil, serves the easygoing quest for comfortable self-preservation. But there's a second side to the coin. Persons deeply committed to values are admired. Their intense belief is the proof of autonomy, freedom, and creativity. Such persons are the contrary of easygoing, and they have standards, all the more worthy because they are not received from tradition. Value here serves those who are looking for fresh inspiration, for new beliefs about good and evil, at least as powerful as the old ones that have been demythologized by scientific reason. This interpretation seems to say that dying for values is the noblest of acts. Nature is indifferent to good and evil. Man's interpretations prescribe a law of life to nature. Thus, our use of the value language leads us into two opposite directions: to follow the line of least resistance and to adopt strong poses and fanatic resolutions. But these are merely different deductions from a common premise, that values are not discovered by reason, and it is fruitless to seek them, to try to find the truth or the good life. The quest begun by Odysseus and continued over 3 millennia has come to an end with the observation that there is nothing to seek. This alleged fact was announced by Nietzsche just over a century ago, when he said, "God is dead." Good and evil now, for the first time, appeared as values, of which there have been 1,001, none rationally or objectively preferable to any other. The salutary illusion about the existence of good and evil has been definitively dispelled. For Nietzsche, this was an unparalleled catastrophe. It meant the decomposition of culture and the loss of human aspiration. Nietzsche, with the utmost gravity, told modern man that he was free-falling in the abyss of nihilism. Modern democracy was, of course, the target of Nietzsche's criticism. Its rationalism and its egalitarianism are the contrary of creativity. Its daily life is for him the civilized reanimalization of man. Nobody really believes in anything anymore, and everyone spends his life in frenzied work and frenzied play so as not to look into this abyss. Nevertheless, all this has become everyday fare in the United States, and the most popular schools of psychology take value positing as the standard of healthy personality. Woody Allen's comedy is nothing but a set of variations on the theme of the man who does not have a real self or identity, and who feels superior to the inauthentically self-satisfied people because he is conscious of his situation, and at the same time inferior to them because they are adjusted. This borrowed psychology turns into a textbook in Zelig, which is the story of an other-directed man as opposed to an autonomous man, terms popularized in the 1950s by David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd. I was astounded to see how doctrinaire Woody Allen is, and how normal his way of looking at things, which has immediate roots in the most profound German philosophy, has become in the American entertainment market. Zelig is a man who literally becomes whoever or whatever is expected of him. A Republican when with the rich, a gangster when with mafiosi, black, Chinese, or female when with blacks, Chinese, or females. He is nothing in himself, just a collection of roles prescribed by others. He inevitably enters into psychiatric treatment, where we learn that he was once tradition-directed, that is, from a family of silly, dancing rabbinic Jews. Tradition-directed means to be guided by old values, received from old beliefs, usually religious, which give a man a role that he takes to be more than a role. It goes without saying that, for Allen, a return to that old mode of adjustment and apparent health is neither possible nor desirable. One is supposed to laugh at the dancing Jew, although it is not clear whether from the point of view of alienation or health. His health is restored when he becomes autonomous, when he follows his real instincts and sets his own values. Thus, when Zelig hears people say that it is a nice day, when it manifestly is, he responds that it is not a nice day. So he is immediately clapped back into a mental institution by those whom he previously tried to imitate, and with whose opinions he is now at war. This is the way society imposes its values on the creator. Woody Allen's haunted comedy diagnoses our ills as stemming from value relativism, for which the cure is value positing. And his great strength is in depicting the self-conscious role player who is never quite at home in his role. Such a man is interesting because he is trying so hard to be like the others, who are ridiculous because they are unaware of their emptiness. But Allen is tasteless and superficial in playing with his Jewishness, which apparently has no inner dignity for him. And where he fails completely is in his presentation of the healthy, autonomous man, who is neither funny nor interesting. This is the figure against which the others are understood and judged, as misers are ridiculous only compared to the man who knows the real value of money. But Allen's autonomous man is simply empty or non-existent. Here is where we confront the nothing, but it is not clear that Allen knows it. This is all terribly lightweight and disappointing, for it really tries to assure us that the agonies of our nihilism are just neuroses that can be cured by a little therapy and by a little stiffening of our backs. Woody Allen helps to make us feel comfortable with nihilism, to Americanize it. I'm okay, thou art okay too, if we agree to be a bit haunted together. We have here the peculiarly American way of digesting continental despair. It is nihilism with a happy ending. In politics, in entertainment, in religion, everywhere, we find a language connected with Nietzsche's value revolution, a language necessitated by a new perspective on the things of most concern to us. Words such as charisma, lifestyle, commitment, identity, and many others, all of which can easily be traced to Nietzsche, are now practically American slang. But they, and the things to which they refer, would have been incomprehensible to our fathers, not to speak of our founding fathers. What an extraordinary thing it is that high-class talk from what was the peak of Western intellectual life in Germany has become as natural as chewing gum on American streets. The image of this astonishing Americanization of the German pathos can be seen in the smiling face of Louis Armstrong as he belts out the words of his great hit, Mac the Knife. As most American intellectuals know, it is a translation of the song Mackie Messer from the Threepenny Opera, a monument of Weimar Republic popular culture written by two heroes of the artistic left, Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill. There is a strange nostalgia among many of the American intelligentsia for this moment, just prior to Hitler's coming to power, Lotte Lenya's rendition of this song has long stood with Marlene Dietrich singing her famous song about love, Ich bin von Kopf bis Fuß auf Liebe eingestellt, in The Blue Angel, as the symbol of a charming, neurotic, sexy, decadent longing for some hazy fulfillment not quite present to the consciousness. Less known to our intelligentsia is an aphorism in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, a book well known to Brecht, entitled On the Pale Criminal. This aphorism tells the story of a neurotic murderer, eerily resembling Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, who does not know, cannot know, that the murder he committed is legitimated by a valid motive. He lusted after the joy of the knife. This scenario for Mac the Knife is the beginning of the supramoral attitude of expectancy, waiting to see what the volcano of the id will spew forth, which appealed to Weimar and its American admirers. With Armstrong taking Lenya's place, it is all mass-marketed, and the message becomes less dangerous, although no less corrupt. We have come back to the point where we began, where values take the place of good and evil. Whether this value relativism is harmonious with democracy is a question that is dealt with by never being raised. Once one plunges into the abyss, there is no assurance whatsoever that equality, democracy, or socialism will be found on the other side. The conditions of value creation, particularly its authoritative and religious or charismatic character, would seem to militate against democratic rationalism. The sacred roots of community are contrary to the rights of individuals and liberal tolerance, and the new religiosity connected with community and culture led Nietzsche to honor immoderation over moderation and to ridicule morality. How it looked to thoughtful Germans is most revealingly expressed in a famous passage by Max Weber about God, science, and the irrational. Quote, finally, although a naive optimism may have celebrated science as the path which would lead to happiness, I believe I can leave this entire question aside in light of the annihilating critique which Nietzsche has made of the last men who have discovered happiness. Who then still believes in this, with the exception of a few big babies in university chairs or in editorial offices? End quote. So penetrating and well-informed an observer as Weber could say in 1919 that the scientific spirit at the heart of Western democracy was dead for all serious men, and that Nietzsche had killed it. All those Americans who said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," shared this rationalist dream. But the presentation of the last men, the debased modern men who think only of safety and comfort, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, was so decisive that the old-style Enlightenment rationalism need not even be discussed anymore. Reason cannot establish values, according to Nietzsche and Weber, and its belief that it can is the stupidest and most pernicious illusion. Weber tells us what the single fundamental issue is: the relation between reason, or science, and the human good. From Nietzsche, he learned that religion, or the sacred, is the most important human phenomenon. God is dead, Nietzsche proclaimed. But he did not say this on a note of triumph, in the style of earlier atheism. The tyrant has been overthrown, and man is now free. Rather, he said it in the anguished tone of the most powerful and delicate piety, deprived of its proper object. Honesty compels serious men, on examination of their consciences, to admit that the old faith is no longer compelling. Nietzsche replaces easygoing or self-satisfied atheism with agonized atheism. Longing to believe, along with intransigent refusal to satisfy that longing, is, according to him, the profound response to our entire spiritual condition. Nietzsche says that modern man is losing, or has lost, the capacity to value, and therewith his humanity. Our self-satisfaction, the desire to be adjusted, the search for comfortable solutions to problems, the whole program of the welfare state are the signs of the incapacity to look up toward the heaven of man's possible perfection or self-overcoming. In the present exhaustion of the old values, according to Nietzsche, men must be brought to the abyss, terrified by the danger and nauseated by what could become of them, in order to make them aware of their responsibility for their fate. Stripping away the illusions about values was required, so Nietzsche thought, by our situation, to disenchant all misleading hopes of comfort or consolation, and thereby to fill the few creators with awe and the awareness that everything depends on them. Nihilism is a dangerous but a necessary and a possibly salutary stage in human history. In it, man faces his true situation. It can break him, reduce him to suicide, but it can also hearten him to a reconstruction of a world of meaning. Nietzsche's works are a glorious exhibition of the soul of a man who might, if anybody can, be called creative. They constitute the profoundest statement about creativity by a man who had a burning need to understand it. Nietzsche was ineluctably led to meditation on the coming to be of God, for God is the highest value on which the others depend. God is not creative, for God is not. But God, as made by man, reflects what man is, unbeknownst to himself. Moses, overpowered by the obscure drives within him, went to the peak of Sinai and brought back tables of values. These values had a necessity, a substantiality, more compelling than health or wealth. They were the core of life. There is no prescription for creating the myths that constitute a people, no standardized test that can predict the man who will create them or determine what myths will work or are appropriate. There is nothing that underlies the myth, no substance, no cause. No rational quest for knowledge of good and evil can result in an accurate account of values. Authentic values are those by which a life can be lived, which can form a people that produces great deeds and thoughts. Moses, Jesus, Homer, Buddha, these are the creators, the men who formed horizons, the founders of Jewish, Christian, Greek, or Indian culture. It is not the truth of their thought that distinguished them, but its capacity to generate culture. Since values are not rational and not grounded in the natures of those subject to them, they must be imposed. They must defeat opposing values. Rational persuasion cannot make them believed, so struggle is necessary. Producing values and believing in them are acts of the will. Lack of will, not lack of understanding, becomes the crucial defect. Commitment is the moral virtue because it indicates the seriousness of the agent. Nietzsche was a cultural relativist, and he saw what that means. War, great cruelty rather than great compassion. War is the fundamental phenomenon on which peace can sometimes be forced, but always in the most precarious way. Liberal democracies do not fight wars with one another because they see the same human nature and the same rights applicable everywhere and to everyone. Cultures fight wars with one another. They must do so because values can only be asserted or posited by overcoming others, not by reasoning with them. Culture means a war against chaos and a war against other cultures. And the very idea of culture carries with it a value. Man needs culture and must do what is necessary to create and maintain cultures. There is no place for a theoretical man to stand. To live, to have any inner substance, a man must have values, must be committed. Therefore, a cultural relativist must care for culture more than for truth. Conflict is the evil we most want to avoid among nations, among individuals, and within ourselves. Nietzsche sought, with his value philosophy, to restore the harsh conflicts for which men were willing to die, to restore the tragic sense of life at a moment when nature had been domesticated and men become tame. But that value philosophy was used in America for exactly the opposite purpose, to promote conflict resolution, bargaining, harmony. If it is only a difference of values, then conciliation is possible. We must respect values, but they must not get in the way of peace. Our desire for conflict reduction accounts for the great popularity of the word dialectic in our sense, the Marxist sense. For beginning in opposites, it ends in synthesis, all charms and temptations united in harmony. In philosophy and morals, the hardest and most essential rule is, you can't eat your cake and have it too. But dialectic overcomes this rule. Dialectic solves problems that God and nature had previously seemed to make insoluble, and earlier men had made a virtue of living with. Man has always had to come to terms with God, love, and death. They made it impossible to be perfectly at home on earth. But America is coming to terms with them in new ways. God was slowly executed here. It took 200 years, but local theologians tell us he is now dead. His place has been taken by the sacred. Love was put to death by psychologists. Its place has been taken by sex and meaningful relationships. It should not be surprising that a new science, thanatology, or death with dignity, is on the way to putting death to death. Coming to terms with the terror of death, Socrates' long and arduous education, learning how to die, will no longer be necessary. On Sunday mornings, educated men used to be harangued about death and eternity. This is not a danger to be run in doing battle with the Sunday New York Times. Forgetting in a variety of subtle forms is one of our primary modes of problem solving. We are learning to feel comfortable with God, love, and even death. I suspect that if we were to make a law forbidding the use of any of the words in this new language of value relativism, a large part of the population would be silenced. Technical discourse would continue, but all that concerns right and wrong, happiness, the way we ought to live, would become quite difficult to express. These words are there where thoughts should be, and their disappearance would reveal the void. The exercise would be an excellent one, for it might start people thinking about what they really believe and about what lies behind the formulas. Would living exactly as I please be speakable as a substitute for lifestyle? Would my opinion do for values, my prejudices for my ideology? Could rabble-rousing or simply divine stand in for charisma? Each of the standard words seems substantial and respectable. They appear to justify one's tastes and deeds, and human beings need to have such justification. We have to have reasons for what we do. I have never met a person who says, I believe what I believe. These are just my values. There are always arguments. However, these words are not reasons, nor were they intended to be reasons. All to the contrary, they were meant to show that our deep human need to know what we are doing and to be good cannot be satisfied. By some miracle, these very terms became our justification, nihilism as moralism. It is not the immorality of relativism that I find appalling. What is astounding and degrading is the dogmatism with which we accept such relativism and our easygoing lack of concern about what that means for our lives.
The Democratic University and the Sixties. The university is an especially important institution in a democracy. Using Tocqueville's portrait of the intellectual life of the Americans in Democracy in America as his guide, Professor Bloom describes various impediments to the free exercise of reason in a democracy: the irresistible power of public opinion, the lack of awareness of alternative understandings, the temptation to flatter the people, the contempt for the theoretical life. Bloom believes that it is the university's task to defend reason against these threats. It has not always performed this function very well. During the 60s, in particular, Bloom thinks that the universities failed to resist the popular movements that threatened them. This failure had devastating effects that continue to afflict the universities today.
Tocqueville taught me the importance of the university to democratic society. His noble book, Democracy in America, gave voice to my inchoate sentiments. His portrait of the intellectual life of the Americans is the mirror in which we can see ourselves. Tocqueville shows how a democratic regime causes a particular intellectual bent, which, if not actively corrected, distorts the mind's vision. The great democratic danger, according to Tocqueville, is enslavement to public opinion. The claim of democracy is that every man decides for himself. The use of one's natural faculties to determine for oneself what is true and false and good and bad is the American philosophic method. Democracy liberates from tradition, which in other kinds of regimes determines the judgment. Prejudices of religion, class, and family are leveled, not only in principle, but also in fact, because none of their representatives has any intellectual authority. Equal political right makes it impossible for church or aristocracy to establish the bastions from which they can affect men's opinions. Even if men seek authority, they cannot find it where they used to find it in other regimes. Thus, the external impediments to the free exercise of reason have been removed in democracy. This promotes a measure of reason. But, in the absence of anything else to which to turn, the common beliefs of most men are almost always what will determine judgment. This is just where tradition used to be most valuable. Without being seduced by its undemocratic and anti-rational mystique, tradition does provide a counterpoise to the merely current and contains the petrified remains of old wisdom, along with much that is not wisdom. The active presence of a tradition in a man's soul gives him a resource against the ephemeral, the kind of resource that only the wise can find simply within themselves. The paradoxical result of the liberation of reason is greater reliance on public opinion for guidance, a weakening of independence. Altogether, reason is exposed at the center of the stage. Although every man in democracy thinks himself individually the equal of every other man, this makes it difficult to resist the collectivity of equal men. If all opinions are equal, then the majority of opinions, on the psychological analogy of politics, should hold sway. So unless there is some strong ground for opposition to majority opinion, it inevitably prevails. This is the really dangerous form of the tyranny of the majority. Not the kind that actively persecutes minorities, but the kind that breaks the inner will to resist, because there is no qualified source of non-conforming principles and no sense of superior right. The majority is all there is. What the majority decides is the only tribunal. It is not so much its power that intimidates, but its semblance of justice. Tocqueville found that Americans talked very much about individual right, but that there was a real monotony of thought and that vigorous independence of mind was rare. The kinds of questions that Tocqueville put to America came out of an experience that we cannot have, his direct experience of an aristocracy and the aristocratic temper of soul. On the basis of this experience, Tocqueville was able to affirm the justice of equality more reasonably than most of us can. If we cannot in any way have access to something like that experience, our understanding of the range of human possibilities is impoverished, and our capacity to assess our strengths and weaknesses is diminished. To make that range of possibilities accessible, to overcome our democratic regime's tendency to discourage appreciation of important alternatives, the university must come to the aid of unprotected and timid reason. Freedom of the mind requires not only, or not even especially, the absence of legal constraints, but the presence of alternative thoughts. The most successful tyranny is not the one that uses force to assure uniformity, but the one that removes the awareness of other possibilities. Sycophancy towards those who hold power is a fact in every regime, but especially in a democracy. In a democracy, unlike tyranny, there is an accepted principle of legitimacy that breaks the inner will to resist. There is no legitimate power other than the people to which a man can turn. Repugnance at the power of the people, at the fact that the popular taste should rule in all arenas of life, is very rare in a modern democracy. Flattery of the people and incapacity to resist public opinion are the democratic vices, particularly among writers, artists, journalists, and anyone else who is dependent on an audience. Aristocracies hate and fear demagogues most of all, while democracies, in their pure form, hate and fear elitists most of all. Elitists are thought to be unjust because they do not accept the leading principle of justice in democratic regimes. Hence, democracy discounts those who are most likely to recognize and compensate for its political and intellectual propensities, while it admires those who encourage them. In addition, the democratic concentration on the useful, on the solution of what are believed by the people to be the most pressing problems, makes theoretical distance seem not only useless, but immoral. When there is poverty, disease, and war, who can claim the right to idle in Epicurean gardens, asking questions that have already been answered, and keeping a distance where commitment is demanded? Whenever there is a crunch, democratic men devoted to thought have a crisis of conscience and have to find a way to interpret their endeavors by the standard of utility. It is to prevent or cure these specifically democratic kinds of blindness that the university may be said to exist in a democracy. It exists not for the sake of establishing an aristocracy, but for the sake of democracy and the freedom of the mind, certainly one of the most important freedoms. The successful university is the proof that a society can be devoted to the well-being of all without stunting human potential or imprisoning the mind to the goals of the regime. It is necessary that there be an unpopular institution in our midst that sets clarity above well-being or compassion, that resists our powerful urges and temptations, that is free of all snobism, but has standards. The university's task is thus well defined, if not easy to carry out. It is, in the first place, always to maintain the permanent questions front and center. This it does primarily by keeping alive the works of those who best treated of them. In the Middle Ages, Aristotle was very much present in the minds of the leading elements of society. He was used as an authority, almost on a level with the Church Fathers, and was assimilated to them. This was, of course, an abuse of Aristotle, who thought that authority is the contrary of philosophy. His own teaching ought always to be approached with questions and doubts, not faith. Nevertheless, Aristotle was there, and his moderate and sensible views had an effect on the world. Moreover, he could be a guide to those who came to have real philosophic doubt. In our time, freedom from authority and the independence of reason are commonplaces. Aristotle, however, instead of being properly used, now that we have the proper disposition, has virtually disappeared. Instead, we are more and more restricted to the narrow experience of the here and now, with a consequent loss of perspective. Reason has become a prejudice for us. Rousseau noted that in his time, many men were liberals who, a century earlier, would have been religious fanatics. He concluded that they were not really reasonable, but rather conformists. Reason, transformed into prejudice, is the worst form of prejudice, because reason is the only instrument for liberation from prejudice. The most important function of the university in an age of reason is to protect reason from itself by being the model of true openness. Hence, without having the answers, the university knows what openness is and knows the questions. It also knows the regime within which it lives and the kinds of threats this regime poses to its activity. As the repository of the regime's own highest faculty and principle, it must have a strong sense of its importance outside the system of equal individuality. It must be contemptuous of public opinion because it has within it the source of autonomy, the quest for and even discovery of the truth according to nature. The university must resist the temptation to try to do everything for society. To sum up, there is one simple rule for the university's activity. It need not concern itself with providing its students with experiences that are available in democratic society. They will have them in any event. It must provide them with experiences they cannot have there. Tocqueville did not believe that the old writers were perfect, but he believed that they could best make us aware of our imperfections, which is what counts for us. The universities never performed this function very well, but they have now practically ceased trying. "You don't have to intimidate us," said the famous professor of philosophy in April 1969 to 10,000 triumphant students supporting a group of black students who had just persuaded us, the faculty of Cornell University, to do their will by threatening the use of firearms as well as threatening the lives of individual professors. The professors, the repositories of our best traditions and highest intellectual aspirations, were fawning over what was nothing better than a rabble. They were publicly confessing their guilt and apologizing for not having understood the most important moral issues, the proper response to which they were learning from the mob. And they were expressing their willingness to change the university's goals and the content of what they taught. As I surveyed this spectacle, Marx's dictum kept coming to my mind against my will. History always repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. The American university in the 60s was experiencing the same dismantling of the structure of rational inquiry as had the German university in the 30s. No longer believing in their higher vocation, both gave way to a highly ideologized student populace, and the content of the ideology was the same: value commitment. The university had abandoned all claim to study or inform about value. It thereby undermined the sense of the value of what it taught, while turning over the decision about values to the folk, the zeitgeist, the relevant. As Hegel was said to have died in Germany in 1933, Enlightenment in America came close to breathing its last during the 60s. The fact that the universities are no longer in convulsions does not mean that they have regained their health. As in Germany, the value crisis in philosophy made the university prey to whatever intense passion moved the masses. Hardly any element in the university believed seriously that its distance was based on something true and necessary, the self-confident possession of the kind of standpoint outside of public opinion that made it easy for Socrates to resist the pious fanaticism of the Athenian people, or to refuse to collaborate with the Athenian tyrants. The fact that in Germany the politics were of the right, and in the United States of the left, should not mislead us. In both places, the universities gave way under the pressure of mass movements, and did so in large measure because they thought those movements possessed a moral truth superior to any the university could provide. Commitment was understood to be profounder than science, passion than reason. In fact, the thought was the same. A distinguished professor of political science proved this when he read to his radical students some speeches about what was to be done. They were enthusiastic until he informed them that the speeches were by Mussolini. The most sinister formula in Heidegger's rectoral address of 1933 was, with only the slightest of alterations, the slogan of the American professors who collaborated with the student movements of the 60s. The time for decision is past. The decision has already been made by the youngest part of the German nation. There were two results of the campus disruptions. The university was incorporated much more firmly into the system of democratic public opinion, and the condition of cave-like darkness amidst prosperity feared by Tocqueville was brought painfully near. When the dust settled, it could be seen that the very distinction between educated and uneducated in America had been leveled. The very ideas of truly different goals and motives of action,
incarnated not only in systems of thought, but in real and poetic models, began to disappear. Freedom had been restricted in the most effective way, by the impoverishment of alternatives. Nothing that was not known to or experienced by those who constitute the enormous majority, which is ultimately the only authority in America, had any reality. All the radicalism of the 60s was intended to hasten our movement in the directions in which we were already going, and never really to question these directions. It was an exercise in egalitarian self-satisfaction that wiped out the elements of the university curriculum that did not flatter our peculiar passions or tastes of the moment. About the 60s, it is now fashionable to say that, although there were indeed excesses, many good things resulted. But, so far as universities are concerned, I know of nothing positive coming from that period. It was an unmitigated disaster for them. I hear that the good things were greater openness, less rigidity, freedom from authority, and so on. But these have no content and express no view of what is wanted from a university education. During the 60s, I sat on various committees at Cornell and continuously and futilely voted against dropping one requirement after the next. The old core curriculum was abandoned. The reforms were without content, made for the autonomous person. They were an acquiescence in a leveling off of the peaks, and were the source of the collapse of the entire American educational structure. This is now recognized by all parties when they talk about the need to go back to basics. This collapse is directly traceable to both the teachings and the deeds of the universities in the 60s. Now, it may be possible, with a lot of effort and political struggle, to return to earlier standards of accomplishment in the 3 R's. But it will not be so easy to recover the knowledge of philosophy, history, and literature that was trashed. One cannot jump on and off the tradition like a train. Once broken, our link with it is hard to renew. The instinctive awareness of meanings, as well as the stores of authentic learning in the heads of scholars, are lost. Calming the universities down, stopping grade inflation, making students study, all of that may be salutary, but it does not go to the heart of the matter. There is much less in the university to study now. A final part of the mythology of the 60s is the alleged superior moral concern of the students. Morality became all the rage in the late 60s, succeeding the hard-nosed realism of the preceding years. But what was meant by morality has to be made clear. There is a perennial and unobtrusive view that morality consists in such things as telling the truth, paying one's debts, respecting one's parents, and doing no voluntary harm to anyone. Those are all things easy to say and hard to do. They do not attract much attention and win little honor in the world. This morality always requires sacrifice. This was not the morality that came into vogue in the 60s, which was an altogether more histrionic version of moral conduct, the kind that characterizes heroes in extreme situations. Thomas More's resistance to a tyrant's commands was the daily fare of students' imaginations. Such challenges, which arise rarely, are always ambiguous in terms of both duty and motive, and require the subtlest reasoning, as well as all the other virtues, in the highest degree, in order to be addressed justly, were the moral stuff on which these cubs teethed. It was not, of course, the complexity of such cases that was attractive, but their brilliance, the noble pose. Somehow, it was never the everyday business of obeying the law that was interesting. More interesting was breaking it in the name of the higher law. Hitler became the regulative principle of the conscience. You wouldn't obey Hitler, would you? So refined had the capacity for moral discrimination become. It followed that the elected American officials and the duly approved federal, state, and local laws had no more authority than Hitler. This was the temper of the moral revival.
The models were a mixture of the makers of revolution, who hawk new moralities and liberate from prevailing constraints, and the heroes of popular existentialist literature, whose morality consists in self-affirmation. One began to suspect that the new moralism was just a new dress for the anti-morality of the preceding generation, which thought morality repression.
The Contemporary University. In the concluding sections of The Closing of the American Mind, Professor Bloom takes his readers on a tour of the contemporary university. The natural sciences, according to Professor Bloom, are healthy and robust, but they do not help us to answer the questions that are most important for us as human beings, about how we ought to live. The social sciences are an attempt to imitate natural science in the study of human beings, but they have proved to be rather narrow and technical, however useful. Finally, the humanities are the most impoverished, because few are willing to believe that the old books contained there might teach the truth, so that study in the humanities is now merely idle speculation about bizarre myths. There is thus no place in the contemporary university where it is possible to investigate the humanizing question, what is man?
What image does a first-rank college or university present today to a teenager leaving home for the first time, off to the adventure of a liberal education? He has 4 years of freedom to discover himself, a space between the intellectual wasteland he has left behind and the inevitable, dreary professional training that awaits him after the baccalaureate. In this short time, he must learn that there is a great world beyond the little one he knows, experience the exhilaration of it, and digest enough of it to sustain himself in the intellectual deserts he is destined to traverse. He must do this, that is, if he is to have any hope of a higher life. These are the charmed years, when he can, if he so chooses, become anything he wishes, and when he has the opportunity to survey his alternatives, not merely those current in his time or provided by the careers, but those available to him as a human being. The importance of these years for an American cannot be overestimated. They are our civilization's only chance to get to him. In looking at him, we are forced to reflect on what he should learn if he is to be called educated. We must speculate on what the human potential to be fulfilled is. In the specialties, we can avoid such speculation, but here it is a simple duty. What are we to teach this person? The answer may not be evident, but to attempt to answer the question is already to philosophize and to begin to educate. Such a concern in itself poses the question of the unity of man and the unity of the sciences. It is childishness to say, as some do, that everyone must be allowed to develop freely, that it is authoritarian to impose a point of view on the student. In that case, why have a university? Choices and reflection on the reasons for those choices are unavoidable. The university has to stand for something. The practical effects of unwillingness to think positively about the contents of a liberal education are, on the one hand, to ensure that all the vulgarities of the world outside the university will flourish within it, and on the other, to impose a much harsher and more illiberal necessity on the student, the one given by the imperial and imperious demands of the specialized disciplines, unfiltered by unifying thought. The university now offers no distinctive visage to the young person. He finds a democracy of the disciplines, This democracy is really an anarchy, because there are no recognized rules for citizenship and no legitimate titles to rule. In short, there is no vision, nor is there a set of competing visions of what an educated human being is. The question has disappeared, for to pose it would be a threat to the peace. There is no organization of the sciences, no tree of knowledge. Out of chaos emerges dispiritedness, because it is impossible to make a reasonable choice. Better to give up on a liberal education and get on with a specialty in which there is at least a prescribed curriculum and a prospective career. The student gets no intimation that great mysteries might be revealed to him, that new and higher motives of action might be discovered within him, that a different and more human way of life might be available to him. The universities do not dare to state the radical truth, a well-kept secret. The colleges do not have enough to teach their students, not enough to justify keeping them 4 years. If the focus is careers, there is hardly one specialty outside of the hardest of the hard natural sciences which requires more than 2 years of preparatory training prior to graduate studies. The rest is just wasted time or a period of ripening until the students are old enough for graduate studies. It is amazing how many undergraduates are poking around for courses to take, without any plan or question to ask, just filling up their college years. With rare exceptions, the courses are parts of specialties and not designed for general cultivation or to investigate questions important for human beings simply. These great universities, which can split the atom, find cures for the most terrible diseases, conduct surveys of whole populations, and produce massive dictionaries of lost languages, cannot generate a modest program of general education for undergraduate students. This is a parable for our times. It is becoming all too evident that liberal education has no content, that a certain kind of fraud is being perpetrated. Liberal education has always been a battleground for those who are somewhat eccentric in relation to the specialties. It is in something like the condition of churches, as opposed to, say, hospitals. Nobody is quite certain of what the religious institutions are supposed to do anymore, but they seem to respond to a real human need. They invite the exploitation of quacks, adventurers, cranks, and fanatics, but they also solicit the warmest and most valiant efforts of persons of peculiar gravity and depth. In liberal education, too, the worst and the best fight it out. Fakers and authentics, sophists and philosophers, for the favor of public opinion and for control over the study of man in our times. Of course, the only serious solution is the one that is almost universally rejected, the good old great books approach, in which a liberal education means reading certain generally recognized classic texts, just reading them, letting them dictate what the questions are and the method of approaching them, not forcing them into categories we make up, not treating them as historical products, but trying to read them as their authors wish them to be read. I am perfectly well aware of, and actually agree with, the objections to the great books cult. It is amateurish. It encourages an autodidact self-assurance without competence. One cannot read all of the great books carefully. If one only reads great books, one can never know what a great as opposed to an ordinary book is. There is no way of determining who is to decide what a great book or what the canon is. Books are made the ends and not the means. The whole movement has a certain coarse evangelistic tone that is the opposite of good taste. It engenders a spurious intimacy with greatness, and so forth. But one thing is certain. Wherever the great books make up a central part of the curriculum, the students are excited and satisfied. They feel that they are doing something that is independent and fulfilling, and that they are getting something from the university they cannot get elsewhere. The very fact of this special experience, which leads nowhere beyond itself, provides them with a new alternative and a respect for study itself. From this study, the students get an awareness of the classic, particularly important for our innocent young, an acquaintance with what big questions were when there were still big questions, models, at the very least, of how to go about answering them, and perhaps most important of all, a fund of shared experiences and thoughts on which to ground their friendships with one another. Programs based upon judicious use of great texts provide the royal road to students' hearts. It is the easiest thing in the world to devise courses of study, adapted to the particular conditions of each university, which thrill those who take them. The difficulty is in getting them accepted by the faculty. How are the disciplines today? The big three, natural science, social science, and humanities, that rule the academic roost and determine what is knowledge. Natural science is doing just fine, living alone but happily, running along like a well-wound clock, successful and useful as ever. Its objects and methods are agreed upon. It offers exciting lives to persons of very high intelligence and provides immeasurable benefits to mankind at large. Our way of life is utterly dependent on the natural sciences, and they have more than fulfilled their every promise. Only at the margins are there questions that might threaten their theoretical equanimity. Doubts about whether America produces synoptic scientific geniuses. Doubts about the use of the results of science, such as nuclear weapons. Doubts that lead to biology's need for ethicists, when, as scientists, they know there are no such knowers as ethicists. In general, however, all is well. But where natural science ends, trouble begins. It ends at man, the one being outside of its purview. Or to be exact, it ends at that part or aspect of man that is not body, whatever that may be. All that is human, all that is of concern to us, lies outside of natural science. That should be a problem for natural science, but it is not. It is certainly a problem for us that we do not know what this thing is, that we cannot even agree on a name for this irreducible bit of man that is not body. Somehow this fugitive thing or aspect of man is the cause of science and society and culture and politics and economics and poetry and music. We know what these latter are, but can we really, if we do not know their cause, know what its status is, whether it even exists? The difficulty is reflected in the fact that for the study of this one theme, man, there are two great divisions of the university, humanities and social science, while for bodies there is only natural science. This would all be very well if the division of labor were founded on an agreement about the subject matter and reflected a natural articulation within it, as do the divisions between physics, chemistry, and biology. It could be believed, and is sometimes actually said, mostly in commencement speeches, that social science treats man's social life, and humanities his creative life, the great works of art, and so on. This will not do. Although both social science and humanities are more or less willingly awed by natural science, they have a mutual contempt for one another, the former looking down on the latter as unscientific, the latter regarding the former as Philistine. They do not cooperate. Most important, they occupy much of the same ground. Many of the classic books, now part of the humanities, talk about the same things as do social scientists. But they use different methods and draw different conclusions. The divisions between the two camps disguise old and unresolved struggles about the being of man. The social sciences and the humanities represent the two responses to the crisis caused by the definitive ejection of man from nature, and hence from the purview of natural science or natural philosophy, toward the end of the 18th century. One route led toward valiant efforts to assimilate man to the new natural sciences, to make the science of man the next rung in the ladder down from biology. The other took over the territory newly opened up by Kant, that of freedom as opposed to nature, a territory that would be separate but equal, not requiring the aping of the methods of natural science. Neither challenged the champion, natural science, newly emancipated from philosophy. Social science tried humbly to find a place at court. Humanities tried proudly to set up shop next door. The result has been two continuous and ill-assorted strands of thought about man, one tending to treat him essentially as another of the brutes, without spirituality, soul, self, consciousness, or what have you, the other acting as though he's not an animal or does not have a body. There is no junction of these two roads. One must choose between them, and they end up in very different places. Neither of these solutions has fully succeeded. Social science receives no recognition from natural science. It is an imitation, not a part. And the humanities shop has turned out to be selling diverse and ill-assorted antiques, decaying and ever dustier, while business gets worse and worse. Social science has proved more robust, more in harmony with the world dominated by natural science, and, while losing its inspiration and evangelical fervor, it has proved useful to different aspects of modern life, as the mere mention of economics and psychology indicates. Humanities languish, but this proves only that they do not suit the modern world. It may very well be the indication of what is wrong with modernity. Moreover, the language that in an unscholarly way influences life so powerfully today emerged from investigations undertaken in the realm of freedom. Man is the problem, and we live with various stratagems for not facing it. The strange relations among the three divisions of knowledge in the present university tell us all about it. To look at social science first, it might seem that it has a systematic ordering of its parts, proceeding from psychology to economics to sociology to political science. Unfortunately, there is nothing to this appearance. These various social sciences do not see themselves in any such order of interdependence. They largely work independently. Economics has its own simple built-in psychology, and that provided by the science of psychology is either really part of biology or flatly contradicts the primacy of the motives alleged by economics. Similarly, economics tends to undermine the normal interpretation of political events that political science would make. It is possible to have an economics-guided political science, but it is not necessary. And it is equally possible to have a psychology-guided political science, which would not be the same as the former. It is as though there were a dispute among the various natural sciences about which is primary. Actually, each of the social sciences can and does make a claim to be the beginning point in relation to which the others can be understood. Economics argues for the primacy of the economy or the market, psychology for the individual psyche, sociology for society, anthropology for culture, and political science for the political order. Each specialty can argue that the others are properly parts of the whole that it represents. The social sciences actually represent a series of different and not harmonious perspectives on the human world we see around us. What students actually see today when they first encounter social science are two robust, self-sufficient, self-confident social sciences, economics and cultural anthropology. These are the extremes which have almost nothing to do with each other, while political science and sociology, quite heterogeneous and even chaotic in their contents, are strung tensely between them. It is not surprising that these two disciplines are more explicit than are the other social sciences about their founders, Locke and Rousseau. Locke argued that man's conquest of nature by his work is the only rational response to his original situation. He emancipated greed and showed the illusory character of the countervailing motives. These principles agreed upon, Economics comes into being as the science of man's proper activity, and the free market as the natural and rational order. Rousseau, on the other hand, argued that nature is good, and man far away from it. So the quest for those faraway origins becomes imperative, and anthropology is by that very fact founded. Civilization, practically identical to the free market and its results, threatens happiness and dissolves community. From this follows immediately admiration for tight old cultures that sublimate the economic motive and do not permit the emergence of the free market. What economists believe to be things of the irrational past become the proper study of man, a diagnosis of our ills and a call to the future. Economists teach that the market is the fundamental social phenomenon, and its culmination is money. Anthropologists teach that culture is the fundamental social phenomenon, and its culmination is the sacred. Here is a confrontation between old philosophic teachings: man, the producer of consumption goods, versus man, the producer of culture, the maximizing animal versus the reverent one. These disciplines simply inhabit different worlds. They can be of marginal use to one another, but not in a spirit of community. A few words about political science and its peculiarities might help to clarify the problems of social science as a whole. To begin with, it is, along with economics, the only purely academic discipline that, like medicine, engages a fundamental passion. Political science involves the love of justice, the love of glory, and the love of ruling, and its study could be understood as undertaken in order to ensure the satisfaction of these passions. But unlike medicine and economics, which are quite frank about their relations to health and wealth, and even trumpet them, political science turns modestly away from such avowals, and would even like to break off these unseemly relations. This has something to do with the fact that it is a very old lady indeed, who would prefer not to show her age. Political science goes all the way back to Greek antiquity and has the dubious parentage of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle said that political science is the architectonic science, a ruling science concerned with the comprehensive good or the best regime. But real science does not talk about good and bad, so that had to be abandoned. But both medicine and economics really do talk about good and bad, so the abandonment of the old political goods had the effect of leaving the moral field to health and wealth, in the absence of the common good and justice. Political science has tried to reduce the specifically political motives into sub-political ones, like those proposed in economics. Honor is not a real motive, gain is. Political science spans the old and new views of man and the human sciences. It has a polyglot character. Part of it has joined joyfully in the effort to dismantle the political order, seen as a comprehensive order, and to understand it as a result of sub-political causes. But there are irrepressible, putatively unscientific parts of political science. The practitioners of these parts of the discipline are unable to overcome their unexplained and unexplainable political instincts, their awareness that politics is the authoritative arena of effective good and evil. They therefore engage in policy studies whose end, whether it is stated or not, is action, defense of freedom, avoidance of war, the furthering of equality. Various aspects of justice in action are hot subjects of study. The good regime has to be the theme of such political scientists, if only under cover. So, political science resembles a rather haphazard bazaar with shops kept by a mixed population. This has something to do with its hybrid nature and its dual origins in antiquity and modernity. Its heterogeneity is perhaps debilitating, and one finds there economic theorists, behavioralists, Marxists, historians, and policy researchers. Most unusual of all, political science is the only discipline in the university, with the possible exception of the philosophy department, that has a philosophic branch. This has long been an embarrassment to it, but a combination of serious and fervent scholarship on the part of a few thinkers and the muscle of the rebellious students in the 60s gave political philosophy a reprieve that now looks permanent. It became, for the best and the worst of reasons, the bastion of the reaction against value-free social science and the new social science as a whole. Political philosophy is far from ruling, but it provides at least a reminiscence of those old questions about good and evil, and the resources for examining the hidden presuppositions of modern political science and political life. Aristotle's Politics is still alive there, as well as Locke's Treatise on Civil Government and Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. Students do not now turn to the social sciences in general for the experience of conversion. Particular things or particular professors may be of interest to them for one reason or another. But for any who might happen to be looking for the meaning of life, or who might be able to learn that that is what they should look for, social science is not now the place to go. The secret of social science's great early success with intelligent young Americans was that it was the only place in the university that seemed, however indirectly, to seek the answer to the Socratic question of how one should live. Even when it was most vigorously teaching that values cannot be the subject matter of knowledge, that very teaching taught about life, as shown by such once exciting contrivances as Weber's distinction between the ethics of intention and the ethics of responsibility. This was not textbook learning, but the real stuff of life. Nothing like this is to be found there today. The third island of the university is the almost submerged old Atlantis, the humanities. In it there is no semblance of order, no serious account of what should and should not belong. It is somehow the repair of man or of humanity, the place to go to find ourselves now that everyone else has given up. But where to look in this heap or jumble? For students it requires a powerful instinct and a lot of luck. The analogies tumble uncontrollably from my pen. The humanities are like the great old Paris flea market where, amidst masses of junk, people with a good eye found castaway treasures that made them rich. Or they are like a refugee camp where all the geniuses driven out of their jobs and countries by unfriendly regimes are idling, either unemployed or performing menial tasks. The problem of the humanities, and therefore of the unity of knowledge, is perhaps best represented by the fact that if Galileo, Kepler, and Newton exist anywhere in the university now, it is in the humanities. In order to have a place, they have to be understood as something other than what they were. Great contemplators of the whole of nature who understood themselves to be of interest only to the extent that they told the truth about it. If they were wrong or have been completely surpassed, then they themselves would say that they are of no interest. To put them in the humanities is the equivalent of naming a street after them or setting up a statue in a corner of a park. They are effectively dead. Plato, Bacon, Machiavelli, and Montesquieu are in the same condition, except for that little enclave in political science. The humanities are the repository for all of the classics now, but much of the classic literature claimed to be about the order of the whole of nature and man's place in it, to legislate for that whole, and to tell the truth about it. If such claims are denied, these writers and their books cannot be read seriously, and their neglect elsewhere is justified. They have been saved only on the condition of being mummified. On the portal of the humanities is written, in many ways and many tongues, there is no truth, at least here. The natural sciences are able to assert that they are pursuing the important truth, and the humanities are not able to make any such assertion. That is always the critical point. Without this, no study can remain alive. Vague insistence that without the humanities we will no longer be civilized rings very hollow when no one can say what civilized means, when there are said to be many civilizations that are all equal. The claim of the classic loses all legitimacy when the classic cannot be believed to tell the truth. There is an enormous difference between saying, as teachers once did, "You must learn to see the world as Homer or Shakespeare did," and saying, as teachers now do, "Homer and Shakespeare had some of the same concerns you do and can enrich your vision of the world." In the former approach, students are challenged to discover new experiences and reassess old. In the latter, they are free to use the books in any way they please. Professors of the humanities have long been desperate to make their subjects accord with modernity, rather than challenge it. I do not deny that at least some professors love the works they study and teach, but there is a furious effort to make them up to date, largely by treating them as the matter formed by some contemporary theory, cultural, historical, economic, or psychological. Nietzsche said that after the ministrations of modern scholarship, the symposium is so far away that it can no longer seduce us. Its immediate charm has utterly vanished. When it comes down to it, the humanities scholar is not motivated by inner necessity, by any urgency, certainly not one dictated by old books. The scholar who chooses to study Sophocles could just as well have chosen Euripides. And why a poet and not a philosopher or a historian? Or why, after all, a Greek and not a Turk? Most interesting of all, lost amidst the collection of disciplines in the humanities, modestly sits philosophy. It has been dethroned by political and theoretical democracy, bereft of the passion or the capacity to rule. Its story defines in itself our whole problem. Philosophy once proudly proclaimed that it was the best way of life, and it dared to survey the whole, to seek the first causes of all things, and not only dictated its rules to the special sciences, but constituted and ordered them. The classic philosophic books are philosophy in action, doing precisely these things. But this was all impossible. Hubris, say their impoverished heirs. Real science did not need them, and the rest is ideology or myth. Now they are just books on a shelf. Philosophy was architectonic, had the plans for the whole building, and the carpenters, masons, and plumbers were its subordinates and had no meaning without its plan. Philosophy founded the university, but it could no longer do so. It is no longer a way of life, and it is no longer a sovereign science. An American high school student knows only the word philosophy, and it does not appear to be any more serious a life choice than yoga. The character of the philosophic experience, which Socrates represents, is important because it is the soul of the university. That experience, and the relation to civil society of those who have it, which is the general formula for the problem of the university, is the continuous theme of Plato's and Xenophon's writings, which give us a flesh and blood Socrates. They present the ambiguous material for judging him ourselves, showing us how such a man lives, the questions he raises, the different kinds of friends he has, his relation to the rulers, the laws, and the gods, and the effects he has on the world around him. The meditation on Socrates is the inspiring theme of philosophy from Plato and Aristotle through Farabi and Maimonides, Machiavelli, Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Rousseau, and Hegel, to Nietzsche and Heidegger. The tiny band of men who participate fully in this way of life are the soul of the university. This is true in historical fact as well as in principle. Universities came to be where men were inspired by the philosophers' teachings and examples. Philosophy and its demonstration of the rational, contemplative life made possible and, more or less consciously, animated scholarship and the individual sciences. When those examples lost their vitality or were overwhelmed by men who had no experience of them, the universities decayed or were destroyed. This, strictly, is barbarism and darkness. I do not mean that philosophers were ordinarily present in universities any more than prophets or saints are ordinarily present in houses of worship. But because those houses of worship are dedicated to the spirit of the prophets and saints, they are different from other houses. They can undertake many functions not central to that spirit, but they must remain what they are because of what they look up to, and everything they do is informed by that reverence. Although the comparison is not entirely appropriate, the university is also informed by the spirit, which very few men can fully share, of men who are absent, but it must preserve respect for them. The philosophic life is not the university. Until the 19th century, most philosophers had nothing to do with universities, and perhaps the greatest abhorred them. One cannot imagine Socrates as a professor for reasons that are worthy of our attention, but Socrates is of the essence of the university. It exists to preserve and further what he represents. In effect, it hardly does so anymore. These are the shadows cast by the peaks of the university over the entering undergraduate. Together, they represent what the university has to say about man and his education, and they do not project a coherent image. The differences and the indifferences are too great. It is difficult to imagine that there is either the wherewithal or the energy within the university to constitute or reconstitute the idea of an educated man and establish a liberal education again. However, the contemplation of this scene is in itself a proper philosophic activity. The university's evident lack of wholeness in an enterprise that clearly demands it cannot help troubling some of its members. The questions are all there. They only need to be addressed continuously and seriously for liberal learning to exist, for it does not consist so much in answers as in the permanent dialogue. It is in such perplexed professors that at least the idea might persevere and help to guide some of the needy young persons at our doorstep. The matter is still present in the university. It is the form that has vanished. One cannot and should not hope for a general reform. The hope is that the embers do not die out. Men may live more truly and fully in reading Plato and Shakespeare than at any other time, because then they are participating in essential being and forgetting their accidental lives. The fact that this kind of humanity exists or existed, and that we can somehow still touch it with the tips of our outstretched fingers, makes our imperfect humanity, which we can no longer bear, tolerable. The books, in their objective beauty, are still there, and we must help protect and cultivate the delicate tendrils reaching out toward them through the unfriendly soil of student souls. Human nature, it seems, remains the same in our very altered circumstances, because we still face the same problems, if in different guises, and have the distinctively human need to solve them, even though our awareness and forces have become enfeebled. After a reading of Plato's Symposium, a serious student came to me with deep melancholy and said it was impossible to imagine that magic Athenian atmosphere reproduced, in which friendly men, educated, lively, on a footing of equality, civilized but natural, came together and told wonderful stories about the meaning of their longing. But such experiences are always accessible. Actually, this playful discussion took place in the midst of a terrible war that Athens was destined to lose, and Aristophanes and Socrates, at least, could foresee that this meant the decline of Greek civilization. But they were not given to culture despair, and in these terrible political circumstances, their abandon to the joy of nature proved the viability of what is best in man, independent of accidents, of circumstances. We feel ourselves too dependent on history and culture. This student did not have Socrates, but he had Plato's book about him, which might even be better. He had brains, friends, and a country happily free enough to let them gather and speak as they will. What is essential about that dialogue, or any of the Platonic dialogues, is reproducible in almost all times and places. He and his friends can think together. It requires much thought to learn that this thinking might be what it is all for. That's where we are beginning to fail. But it is right under our noses, improbable, but always present. Throughout my book, I have referred to Plato's Republic, which is for me the book on education, because it really explains to me what I experience as a man and a teacher. And I have almost always used it to point out what we should not hope for as a teaching of moderation and resignation. But all its impossibilities act as a filter to leave the residue of the highest and non-illusory possibility. The real community of man, in the midst of all the self-contradictory simulacra of community, is the community of those who seek the truth, of the potential knowers. That is, in principle, of all men, to the extent they desire to know. But in fact, this includes only a few, the true friends, as Plato was to Aristotle, at the very moment they were disagreeing about the nature of the good. Their common concern for the good linked them. Their disagreement about it proved that they needed one another to understand it. They were absolutely one soul as they looked at the problem. This, according to Plato, is the only real friendship, the only real common good. It is here that the contact people so desperately seek is to be found. The other kinds of relatedness are only imperfect reflections of this one, trying to be self-subsisting, gaining their only justification from their ultimate relation to this one. This is the meaning of the riddle of the improbable philosopher kings. They have a true community that is exemplary for all other communities.